Hello and welcome to Friday Happy Hour here on the Your Strata Property Facebook page. However, we are also somewhere a little bit new this week. We are also streaming to LinkedIn, which is very exciting. It's the first time we have done that. Just recently, I received permission from LinkedIn to live stream via this platform to that platform. So I am hoping that we are reaching some other people who I know are good friends of mine on LinkedIn and may not be able to make it over to Facebook at this time for our happy hours, but can pick us up over on LinkedIn, which is really cool. So I am seeing a number of you here already, ready for Friday happy hour. Have you had a big week as I have? And are you here hanging out for a relaxing week that was a catch up on what's been happening in our space and to hear from our special guest expert I have for us this week? I think you may know who she is. I'll be bringing her on very, very shortly. But if you are here, you're tuning in for happy hour, please do feel free to drop me a comment there in the comment section. Give me a hello. Let me know what you're up to this afternoon. Maybe you have brought a drink for happy hour. I have a drink here, a little bit different this week, not my usual wine. I can see Ash saying hello. So good to see you, Ash. It's been a little while. Good to have you here. It has been a big day. I'm just looking at this comment. Thank you, Bill and Ben. And Cathy can hear this as well. So I'm going to say, Cathy, Bill and Ben is saying less intro, more Cathy. Okay, so let's get on with the show. We will get there, don't worry. Melissa is here. Hi. It's been a big week. I have had a webinar this week. I have had podcast interviews, preparing for our summit this week, which is really, really exciting. I'll tell you a bit more about that soon. You can tell that I've had a big week, or in fact a big day, because I'm sitting down. Usually I've got the stand-up desk going, but yeah, big day on my feet. It has been exhausting. But now it's time to enjoy our happy hour here. I look forward to this. Once a fortnight, we are here catching up, being able to check in with some friends and colleagues that we might not otherwise be able to see in person. We are still sending our love to our friends who are in Victoria, who are in Melbourne, still there in lockdown. It's always good to see our Melburnians, I got that right this week, guys, Melburnians joining us live. Hey to Lachlan, good to see you. Michael is here. Hey, Rob. Hey, Henry. Henry says this is my only phone call from HMP Melbourne. Okay, got you, Henry. It's so good to have you joining us. I am very soon going to welcome in our special guest because Bill and Ben told me to. She is coming in, don't worry. I was chatting to Rena for the podcast earlier today, and she mentioned to me that strata managers are under a little bit of stress at the moment because they are getting pressure from landlords who are really eager to get tenants back into their properties or into their properties at the price that they want. Apparently, it's hard out there at the moment to be renting apartments, getting the returns that investors were otherwise getting pre-pandemic. And she was telling me that the pressure is falling on strata managers to provide bylaws, to respond to agents, to give keys. I'm really, really interested in hearing from strata managers, and I know there are plenty of you here already and lots of you who tune in regularly here to let me know if you're feeling that same stress. It's very interesting. I was chatting to Cathy just in our sound check earlier about to see the behavioural changes and how they're filtering through to our communities and our strata managers, how you guys are coping with that. What are the things, what are the new things that you're having to deal with, and how can we help you? How can we help you to navigate those? We are all in this together. Michelle is here. Hey, I can see Pets in Strata is here. Did put a special comment over on the Pets in Strata group today to let them know that Cathy was going to be here with us. And I think we're going to talk about pets. That is on the agenda. Cheryl is also very keen to hear about pets. Very soon, guys, very soon. Come on, I am leaving you hanging in there. Tell you what, I want to ask you before we bring Cathy on, have you registered for the Shared Space Summit? We have Almost. We are nearly up to 700 registrants for the Shared Space Summit. OMG, that is huge. It is all happening from the 15th to the 18th of September. Over 4 days, I am going to bring you 9 world-leading experts on community, on property, and law. Now, most of these experts have now been announced. You can find out who they are finally over on the summit registration page. 2 more guests were announced this week. Do you know who they are? Head over to yourstrataproperty.com.au/summit, and Rochelle is going to put that link in the comments there for all of us to check out. We have Charles Vogel joining us from the US, the best-selling author of The Art of Community. We are talking about, yes, community. Sam Reese is joining us from Australian Apartment Advocacy. Kat Carmichael from California. We have Ethan Burns talking to us about sustainability. We have very experienced committee member Gordon Strait, Dr. Alex Morris from London, a behavioural psychologist, to talk to us about meetings, and announced today, Rena Van Alst, Strata Manager Extraordinaire. Yes, of course, Rena is involved in the summit. Head over and register. It is absolutely free to attend the summit. This is the world's first online summit for strata property owners. You don't have to pay anything at all for the summit, but you do have to register so that you get access to those summit sessions. And a lot of people are asking me, do we need to be on Facebook to access the summit sessions? Because you've seen that there's going to be some things happening on Facebook during summit week. No, you don't need to be on Facebook to access the sessions. As long as you are registered, you will get a link sent to you direct to your inbox each morning during summit week, giving you access to the summit sessions. You head over, watch those video interviews, and if you are on Facebook, as so many of you are right now, lovely people, you will be able to join us in the afternoon for some live chats, more guests than I am bringing you. We're going to talk about what we've taken away from the summit sessions, what we're going to action in our communities, any questions, thoughts, any aha moments that have happened for you viewing the summit sessions. That's all going to be happening over on Facebook in the afternoons or during summit week. So get yourselves registered so you know exactly what's happening during that week. Now, the last housekeeping update I want to bring you to make sure you know about before I bring in our special guest, Dr. Cathy Sherry. I want to let you know that we have new legislation that has commenced in New South Wales this week. You may have heard that finally the Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Act of 2020 commenced on the 1st of September. That was Tuesday. Now, this is the legislation that gives our New South Wales Building Commissioner, David Chandler, a whole series of new powers, including the power to investigate buildings and building sites to make sure that work is being carried out in compliance with the BCA and Australian standards. The Commissioner can enter the common property without the consent of the owner's corporation for the purpose of carrying out those inspections. The Commissioner can issue stop work orders to developers. The Commissioner can issue rectification orders. He has the power to prevent the issue of occupation certificates and prevent the registration of strata plans if he's not happy. So very, very interesting, very wide-ranging new powers there. I can also tell you, you won't see this on the site yet, but we are definitely talking about building defects as part of the summit. Okay, so bear that in mind. You'll hear a bit more about that next week. But yes, interesting. We have a link here to the new legislation if you want to check that out. Yes, it's relevant to new buildings. It's also relevant to buildings where you might have had some work done within the last 10 years. It is actually retrospective. So these investigative powers, the power to issue rectification orders, it does apply to building work that's been completed within the last 10 years and that may be defective. So very interesting and real changing landscape there for New South Wales when it comes to building defects. Now, I am working off a new platform. Those of you who might have caught my test earlier today, so forgive me if I'm a bit slow with flicking back with screens and comments, just getting used to a few new tabs. If you're just coming in and I can see so many of you there, feel free to say hi and pop me a comment here on Facebook. I am also on LinkedIn at the moment. For the first time, we are live streaming to 2 platforms at once, which is really cool. I can see the LinkedIn comments, but we can't actually type in to reply to them. That's something LinkedIn doesn't have that feature yet. So you may not see our comments, but I can certainly see you and I can see your comments. So please do pop me a hello. And I'm just being asked by Ash what platform. This is StreamYard, Ash. So I have been using BeLive. This is StreamYard. And anyone who is interested in live streaming to LinkedIn from a platform like this, you do have to apply. You do have to get permission. And it does took me about a month to get through and for LinkedIn to process that application. So a couple of people have asked me today what that process is. If you're doing live video, it's something fabulous to get into. You should all be doing some live video, more live video these days and connecting. Think about applying through LinkedIn as well. And if anyone wants more details on that, feel free to reach out. Okay, there we go. That's my tap dance, Bill and Ben. I am done. I am bringing in our special guest, Dr. Cathy Sherry. Cathy is an associate professor at the University of New South Wales Law School and a UNSW Scientia Education Academy Fellow. She is a leading Australian expert on strata and community title, providing advice to government and the private sector on the complexities of collectively owned property, both nationally and internationally. She is currently on the technical committee for the UK Law Commission reform of Commonhold. Cathy's book, Strata Title Property Rights, Private Governance of Multi-Owned Properties, is the first academic legal monograph on strata title in Australia, and it has even been cited by the Privy Council. Cathy's research focuses on the social implications of private communities as well as optimal planning for children. Cathy has a special interest in urban farming and the challenges of providing growing space in high-density cities. She is the team leader for the UNSW Urban Growers, a cross-faculty group that creates food gardens on campus. Cathy is also an academic member of the Australian College of Strata Lawyers, and she is a regular and very popular presenter at our annual conferences. I am bringing her in to join us live now. Welcome, Cathy Sherry.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you for having me.
Hello, Cathy. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. We were having a little bit of a chat off air before we went live about what life has been like for academics in the pandemic. I think you mentioned to me that you've been on lectures all day, which I think means you've been on your couch with a with a whiteboard behind you.
No, I've been in meetings today, but I've spent a lot of time on this couch teaching from this couch. I'm very high tech. I prop a whiteboard up behind me and get my whiteboard marker out, and I film myself doing it that way. But it's a close approximation to what happens in class. So the students, I think, actually quite like low-tech stuff sometimes. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for being here today. We're trying to be as high-tech as possible, and I do want to let our viewers know, if you haven't tuned into a happy hour before, do feel free to pop any comments and questions that you have for Cathy or for me as we're talking about a few things today. We've got a few topics on the agenda. I do want to start with some of your research that I think you were just kicking off towards the beginning of this year, Cathy, when you shared it with us at the annual conference for the Australian College of Strata Lawyers. And your presentation was called Greening Cities, How and Why We Should Put Green Space in Our Cities and on Our Buildings. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted that research? Why are green cities so important?
Well, I suppose, look, one of the things that, to be honest, that prompted it is, if I'm frank, I'm a bit of a hippie at heart. And I find the social part of high-rise buildings very interesting. I must admit that I think probably the most important area of research in high-rise buildings is actually building defects. But I'll be honest with you, it makes me so angry the way it has been dealt with that I actually can't bring myself to do research on it. It just frustrates me so much how badly owners have been treated. So if that's completely of no research use to people listening, but some support for people who are probably very frustrated by it. So I was looking around trying to think about doing positive research, something that was, I don't know, positive, happy, made people feel good. And I must admit, I've been a lifelong gardener. And so I started to look at green cities. And of course, not surprisingly, discovered there's vast amounts of research about green cities. And it's really fascinating research. I also teach a elective course, it's terribly named, called People, Land and Community, which looks at all sorts of things about property law and people in cities. And one of the sections we do is on urban agriculture, which is a very big thing, particularly if anyone's travelled to America in recent years. Urban agriculture is a very big thing in American cities. Their mainstream food system is so appalling. Their alternative food system is actually really, really interesting. So I'd seen a lot of those kind of urban gardens, including on campuses, and so got the idea of including that in my teaching. So I actually get, and I'm also really interested in the idea of teaching through doing, that students need to actually practically understand what they're doing. So I started doing some greening projects on campus, and the UNSW's campus is really a bit like a little mini city. It's a very, very high density site. We have very, very little room, and getting access to land is quite difficult. So that's been a really interesting thing, sort of treating UNSW as a little city in microcosm. So that was the genesis of the research, thinking actually in high density areas, green space is really important. But sorry, going back to your original question about the conference presentation, I thought, well, it's sensible to actually look at the research. And so I started to look at the research and discover that there is so much research on the importance of green space in cities and in the importance of nature for human beings in a whole lot of things, in terms of physical health, in terms of mental health, stress, cognition, people's ability to concentrate. So when I was presenting that conference paper, I thought some of the lawyers might be interested in the benefits of having a garden in their workplace, having a courtyard garden, that being in contact with nature actually really helps your concentration skills. So there's I can talk more about that research if people are interested in it, but it really establishes it's not just that we need green space in cities because it's nice or because a planner told us to. It's actually really fundamentally important for human physical and mental health.
Tell us about this word, biophilia.
Biophilia. It's a term I don't know that was actually coined by E.O. Wilson, but it's certainly the name of his book, and he's an academic from Yale. And it's about this idea that human beings have an innate attraction to nature, that as a result of 2 million years, they think, of living on savannas, human beings have an innate affinity to certain kinds of environments. So we want to look at nature, and this is the kind of stuff that probably, instinctively we all know it's obvious. Like, I don't know if anyone has that experience of your computer starts with a screen save and shows you a beautiful picture of nature, and then at the top asks you, do you like this picture? And I always look at it and go, who says no? Who says no, I don't like that picture of nature? So human beings, we know we like to look at nature. We know that we like to go on holidays in nature, to look at nice views from apartment buildings, to have lovely views from the top of our apartment buildings. Turns out that it's a lot to do with returning to what we're kind of biologically hardwired to like, and that is Wilson's argument is that human beings are hardwired to like open kind of expanses of savannas where it's safe, where you can actually see danger, but there's some kind of interest in the topography. So you can look at, hills and dales, and water features are also very important. And it was quite interesting presenting at the ACL conference in ACL conference in Noosa, because we're sitting at the Sheraton in Noosa. We've been to tour these lovely communities with beautiful, beautiful gardens. And it was very clear we were living embodiments of the fact that human beings are attracted to coastlines, we're attracted to nature, we'd like to look at those things. And so that's what biophilia is that we have an innate attraction to living things, and in particular the natural environment.
And you can see how valuable understanding that, being across that research would be for developers and architects who are planning our new communities, our urban precincts, to understand and to tap into that, so that it's almost this subliminal marketing, isn't it? That we think, oh, I like that. Not quite sure why I like that, but I like it.
Absolutely. Developers all instinctively know that. And one of the things as a property lawyer that jumped out at me in reading E.O. Wilson's book Biophilia is the section where he says, you know, given enough money, human beings, so in the past, you know, kings and lords and people who had a lot of money would always actually create sort of wilderness in miniature for themselves. So whether it was, you know, a lot of the great parks of Europe were originally, of course, part of great estates. They belonged to the king. Kings and the aristocracy started to give them to the people in the 19th century in order to avoid having their heads cut off by the people. So they kind of, you know, kindly doled it out to the public. And that's where a lot of those big, beautiful parks came from. But this was certainly something that rang true to me as a property lawyer. Given the financial means to do so, most people will want to create that in their living environment. They will want to look at a nice garden. I mean, you know, given a choice, we'd all live on 5 acres in Vaucluse in Sydney if we could. It's just not an option, but if we had the money, we would. And so, yeah, and that's something, so developers thinking about, you know, is it worth putting this in? Yes, all communities, is it worth maintaining it? Is it worth creating a green space if we don't have it? It absolutely is. You know, I mean, the bottom line is it'll increase the value of your building without a doubt.
And never more important than now, when so many of us are either stuck at home because the law says we have to stay at home, or at home by choice, just retreating for comfort and security, and thinking about how we can improve these spaces, what we can do to include some green in a space that may not be green. I love what you've been doing there with the urban farming, Cathy, and does that involve you know, what is that? Does that involve getting gardens into buildings and rooftops and things like that?
So part of it is because I actually have gardened my whole life, and I also do believe in just doing things, just having a go. I mean, it's quite interesting in a university. I don't have any scientific training in relation to biology, and nor do I have any landscape architecture training. So I'm in actual fact not burdened by worrying about, oh, am I doing it right? I just do it. And interestingly, one thing I also discovered is in a university where land is in short supply, the fact that I'm actually a land lawyer means that I'm actually I've discovered I had a bit of an ability to get my hands on bits of land. Most of our estate management used to work for developers, and I'm quite accustomed to talking to developers. They don't scare me.
She knows the right people. She's
genuinely nice. Whatever
so,
I ask them to say. But if people are interested, if you just type in UNSW urban growers to the internet, it'll come up. But the university quite literally gave us a concrete cage, and I'm not exaggerating. I could, if I were able to multi-skill, I could flip up some photos for you. But it was literally a dark, dank concrete cage next to the Barker Street car park, if anyone knows UNSW. And we have turned that into a lovely food garden. We've produced a lot of food there. We got raised beds. We had some money from a grand challenge on rapid urbanisation. We got raised beds. We filled them with, potting mix from Australian Net Landscapes, and we planted them out, and it's produced quite an extraordinary amount of food. And I also have planted out the law school, and this is also an interesting way of getting green space into your buildings. We had courtyards in the law school that had, the usual ubiquitous dieties. Nobody looked after it. It was just those, tough plantings that survive without any care. And I asked our head of school, could I dig them up and plant vegetables with my students? And he was like, yeah, knock yourself out. Great, good idea. And so I actually teach I have two electives, people, land and community. I also teach a course called food law, so which is really actually really important for people to understand how plants grow, to understand how people make money out of plants. But we plant those out, and the extraordinary thing is, you don't need a lot of skill, you just have a go, and people get so much enjoyment from it. At work, I often hear people walking past saying, wow, a lot of people have literally never seen food grow. It's quite extraordinary. Have never seen food growing anywhere. So people are really excited by it. The students really enjoy it. They get really good skills. Part of my aim is to get them to leave university not just able to write some esoteric essay on urban agriculture, but actually to have some idea how to green the spaces they live in and they work in. So whether it's a work garden on their roof, or if it's a roof garden, in an apartment building, or, a balcony garden, something like that, just the skills to just have a go, know that you can do it. And it makes such a difference. People get an enormous amount of pleasure. I'm genuinely surprised, and I love gardening. I'm genuinely surprised how much pleasure people seem to get from it.
Yeah, well, I can tell you those young lawyers or law students there in the law school are happy to have, they're lucky to have you, Cathy, exposing them to that part of the world. Little bit of hippie isn't going to
Yeah,
hurt
yeah.
these lawyers.
Yeah, I've just got to admit it. But they do. They like it very much. And in my defence, if you're studying things like intellectual property in relation to plants, if you don't know how plants are propagated, you don't
Yeah,
understand how people make money out of the intellectual property of plants. So
there you go.
it
Yeah,
actually
fascinating
is.
stuff. I'm just heading over to the comments to acknowledge the people who've come in and posted a comment to say hi. Hey, Emiliana. Hi, Ruth. Tim Sarr is here, and he's saying the amazing Cathy Sherry. Cathy's video on YouTube explaining BMCs is the best guide ever. So well spoken and articulated. It makes such a complicated matter so easy to comprehend. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Tim.
Cathy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for sharing. And Tim, if you've got a link for us, pop it into the comments here. And Rochelle can send that over to LinkedIn as well for anyone who's watching us there. Sean's here. He's already on the red. Awesome, Sean. Michael says it's interesting when looking back at the old photos of UNSW 50 years ago, where it was mostly grass.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
not now.
No. And hey, Carol, good to see you come in. All righty. Okay. We are going to talk about pets shortly. Okay. I get everybody on the edge of their seat. I know there's a few people who come over from the Pets and Strata group too. Hear you talk about pets, Cathy. We're going to get there, guys. First of all, Cathy, I have been, ever since I started thinking about this issue, I've been wanting to check in with you. And I know we're planning to do it at the lawyers conference next year. Hopefully that happens. To talk about this issue of the boundary between our private space and our public space in our strata schemes, because it really hit home for me when the pandemic started around about March, when we really started to feel it here in Australia, and we started to see these emergency powers exercised and these public health orders and this new legislation. And at first there was a real assumption that, oh, well, it applies, and it applies to our apartment buildings, and we can't be gathering on our common property, and we can't be in groups, and we can't have these meetings. And then when the lawyers actually started to read the public health orders, there was this real question in New South Wales, at least, whether it did indeed extend so far, and what was the definition of a place of residence? What is private property? What is public space? And I know, Cathy, you take a particular interest in this as well, and have written extensively on that public-private divide in our strata schemes. What's your take on this? Have you seen this boundary being pushed, being ignored, being shifted in the face of a global pandemic?
I have. I mean, I must admit, clearly I don't believe COVID's a conspiracy. I think it's incredibly important that we're careful about this. So I preface all of my comments with that. I was telling Amanda earlier, my eldest daughter lives in Melbourne. She's in a 1-bedroom apartment in lockdown with her fiance. They're both teaching. I'm very aware of how difficult things are in Melbourne. I think it's crazy we're not wearing masks in public in Sydney. So I'm not skeptical about this at all. But I have been, like a lot of lawyers, actually a little bit disturbed by, in particular, the way the police have interpreted the public health order. And this is not even so much about Strata, but I think there's been, in terms of residents, I mean, one thing I was really horrified by is the public health order was absolutely crystal clear that you could move between residences. Absolutely. It's in, Clause 8 of the public health order. Moving between residences was a valid reason for being out of your house during the lockdown. It didn't have a concept of primary residence the way we do for capital gains tax, or, there are statutes that talk about primary residence. It very clearly said you could move between residences, and yet there was this, what you weren't allowed to do was take a holiday in a regional area, but I'm pretty confident that Palm Beach is not a regional area. So that furor about people going to Palm Beach for their second houses, they were legally allowed to. There was no doubt about it. So that was a little bit disturbing for me. In terms of strata schemes, I mean, I suppose what I'd say, I've just at the beginning of this year published an article on discrimination law in strata schemes, which I can give you a link to. But I mean, that looks at the public-private divide, and that is something that I think is I think there's a lot of confusion even amongst lawyers about the fact that common property in strata schemes is private property. It is as private as my backyard is private property. It just happens to be co-owned by lots of people. And one of the problems is that, I mean, that's kind of fairly obvious in a small strata scheme. It's obvious that the halls and the stairwells are private property. When you get very large strata developments, people start to get a bit more confused, particularly if they're publicly accessible. So, you know, if they've got shops and things like that, they are publicly accessible. I mean, and lots of master planned estates, so Breakfast Point, all of those places, they're all publicly accessible. But as we would know as lawyers, Amanda, and no doubt people who live in schemes who are forced to pay for the insurance of common property, it is privately owned property. There is no doubt about it. It's not grey. There's you know, it's black and white. It is private property. Whether we need slightly different rules that apply to it. So, for example, in my discrimination article, one of the things I argue is that we actually have to have some kind of adjustment for the fact that clearly it's private property, but it's not like ordinary private property. So it's not like just a house that's co-owned by a husband and wife. It's a more complicated form of private property, but it is private property. I mean, in terms of the pandemic, I mean, I don't know how much you saw of things like this, but I do know that apartment buildings in New York and it's much easier to do this in America. I mean, a lot of the buildings are co-ops, but even if they're condominiums, it's much easier to do. They were banning anyone coming into the building who wasn't a resident. So they were writing bylaws requiring everyone to wear masks and that nobody could come into the building who wasn't a resident. Now, obviously, New York was in much more desperate straits than we were. Would that be valid in Australia? I strongly suspect it's not. It's not valid. I don't think it's valid. I mean, the common property is owned by everyone. You have a right to be on all bits of common property because it is your private property, and it's a right not just for you, but also for your invitees. I don't know what you think about that, Amanda, but I think it's pretty difficult to say that you can exclude your co-owners' invitees. I don't know.
Yes. Well, firstly, definitely I was getting those questions, and definitely I was hearing about buildings where the building manager at the height of the pandemic had said, no deliveries, no drop-offs, no visitors, no contractors in and out, no renovation works. And the number one thing that disturbed me about that was that it seemed to be a unilateral decision, maybe made by the building manager, maybe made in consultation with a couple of members of the strata committee, maybe the strata manager recommending it or in discussions with the strata manager, and residents just being delivered a circular or a note under the door or an email saying, this is the new policy. And I was immediately uncomfortable with that. I think a decision made in a general meeting where all owners have had the opportunity to decide, are we going to implement some emergency policy or procedure in the best interests of everybody to protect health and safety? And in New South Wales, that decision really did need to be made in relation to gyms and pools, because we were never, under our public health orders, directed to close gyms and pools, even though there was a misunderstanding about that. Different, I understand, in Victoria and in Queensland, their public health orders were a bit clearer. But for sure, that confusion was happening. Yes, there's been discussion about bylaws, COVID bylaws, and whether we have bylaws that mandate masks and bylaws that regulate the coming and going. That's always been something that I too have been uncomfortable about. In New South Wales, we have that provision in our Act about not having harsh, unconscionable or oppressive bylaws. There's something about putting a bylaw in place. You may get it through, but it's also very hard to then change or to repeal. There is thinking of it as an emergency step was a little bit strange to me, that you would adopt bylaws in an emergency situation. But yes, your discrimination paper, Cathy, we do have a link for that. And Rochelle, I'll just ask you to pop that one in the comments there for us. I know, Cathy, there's been some odd decisions from our courts about that applying discrimination law to apartment buildings, both in Victoria. The Black decision, I think, was 1 or 2 years ago now. And we also have a decision that the name has just escaped me, you'll know it, in New South Wales about discrimination. And the Hulina, yeah, exactly. And I've heard you speak about that before. Just for those, and we've got lots here now who I know are highly engaged in this topic and the next one that's coming. Do you want to just share your thoughts on applying that discrimination law to our strata schemes?
Yeah, so look, I think there's a very strong possibility discrimination law doesn't apply to strata schemes, to the activities of an owner's corporation in managing the building, but I think that that's actually a big problem. I think the law needs to be clarified. And the way discrimination law works like this, it's not that there's a law against discriminating against people that just generally operates in society. Discrimination law only operates in relation to specific characteristics, so they are things like race, gender, age, disability, and it depends on some are covered at federal level, so help me out here, Amanda, age, disability,
Sex,
race,
right?
and federal, and the rest are state. So it varies from state to state. So New South Wales, for example, religion is not covered at all because it's not covered at federal level and it's not covered at state level. So it's only in relation to specific things, but then it's also only in relation to particular activities. So it's only in relation to employment, to education, to access to public places, to clubs and associations. It doesn't apply in relation to your private property. So, for example, I can tell someone they can't bring their guard dog into my house and I'm not breaking the law. And I can say that I won't have a relationship with someone because they're not the same religion as me or the same race as me, and I'm not breaking the law. So there is a basic public-private divide in relation to discrimination law. And the difficult thing with strata schemes is that they fall on that line. So technically they are all entirely private property. And that's my problem with the Black decision. There is with all due respect to the judge, I think she was a little bit too swayed by the idea that strata common property was somehow public property. That scheme had publicly accessible property, but it's still simply private property. So it doesn't matter that it is, there's 5,000 people living in a master planned estate. They and all of their invitees can go into common property. It's still privately owned property. So strata schemes are not captured necessarily because they're publicly accessible. But then the other possibility is that they provide goods and services. So that's the other big area where discrimination law operates. So you can't refuse to serve someone in a shop because they're not of they're the wrong gender, race, whatever. So you may not refuse goods and services. The problem is that strata schemes arguably do not provide goods and services, and they certainly don't provide goods and services to the public. So, I mean, the easiest way
What
to
about
think
the
about
front door, Cathy?
it's not, well, this is the thing, it is really, really hard. But like if you think about a 2-lot strata scheme, when they fix their, driveway, they're not providing themselves goods and services. I should stress that I think that it is actually untenable to say that honest corporations are not captured by discrimination law, because it really does mean, you can do some really disturbing things. And so I think that what we need is we actually need to change the strata law to make it explicit that when you are managing common property, you are actually bound by discrimination legislation. That can have significant implications for disability and age-related discrimination, but I think it's realistically, it's the only thing that's viable. It's also to stress this, it's why, for example, we've always had, all states have a provision that says strata schemes can't ban guide dogs, hearing dogs, or now assistance animals, because without those provisions, they could.
Yes.
So that's the clearest evidence that strata schemes were never intended to be captured by discrimination legislation. But I don't think that that's tenable or workable in a modern society, particularly not with very large strata schemes. It's just not tenable.
Yes, and where we're seeing that more so now with our aging population and with people aging in place, which is a laudable goal indeed, is upgrades to the common property. So we're talking about access ramps, we're talking about open closed doors, we're talking about flooring and things like that. And that is just going to increase, I think, the nature of those requests, requirements, and owners corporations having to ask themselves, do we have to? Do we have to upgrade our common property, and is it discriminatory if we don't?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, just for people's sake, there is an out that in all discrimination legislation, there is a provision that says that if it would cost too much money and it's disproportionate, you don't have to do it. So people don't need to be worried that someone's going to make them put a lift into a 3-story strata scheme. They're not. That's not how the law is actually pretty sensible.
Good. Good to hear. Now, Cathy, you mentioned there earlier the magic words. You said guide dogs, you said dogs, you said pets. Here we go. Let's talk about pets, baby. It is something that I know you've had a special interest in. And you do take from that broader perspective. I know you're also interested in children in apartments, and how do our schemes have, if they do have the power to regulate these kinds of issues, if they do have that power, why do they have that power? is it right, and why is it so unusual for our strata schemes and our private citizens, as you say, to have the power to regulate other private citizens? What do you say to people who may say, and this is what they often say to me, I put my hand up very openly and say I am a pro-pet apartment dweller, and people often say to me, isn't it my right to decide what I want as part of the democratic process? Isn't it my right to decide what I want in a building where I live? What do you say to that in the context of pets?
Yeah, I'd say it's no one has a right to decide what somebody else does in their own home. So that's the thing that I think is quite extraordinary. One of the problems is with our legislation, as you know, the bylaw making power is just a blanket power to make bylaws in relation to lots and common property. Victoria is the one state that is different. Oh, and excuse me, the ACT is actually completely different. All other states don't make any distinction between common property and lot property. And when you think about that, that's crazy. You know, that's really, really profoundly bizarre to say that there's no distinction in the majority's power to make rules for your own kitchen as there is in relation to the garden or the gym or the pool or the corridors. That's just nonsensical. And the argument that I make, and is that just for people who are inclined to 18th and 19th century philosophy, I mean, this comes down to a fundamental principle of all liberal democracies, which is negative liberty, which is the basis of liberal democracies. John Stuart Mill: we cannot be regulated by government unless what we are doing has some kind of meaningful or harmful effect on other people. So it is the basis of liberal democracy that the government does not regulate us if we're not hurting somebody else. And the idea that a strata scheme should be different is just, to me, just extraordinary. The idea that government, with all the limits and on that they have to do things for the public good, all the limits that exist on local councils, all of those things, they would be limited in this power. But private citizens running, a small community don't have that limit. They can just do things because they feel like doing it, because they think it's important to them. There has to be some kind of limit on that power, and the most obvious limit is that you should never be able to regulate what somebody does inside their own apartment unless it has some meaningful effect on you. So someone keeping a cat that never leaves the apartment, it is simply none of your business. Or somebody keeping a dog that doesn't disturb you in any way, it's none of your business. And the fact that you might have to share a lift with a dog is not a meaningful harm that the law should allow you to regulate. And if you do find that very harmful, my feeling is don't live in collectively owned land. Like, if you are that terrified of dogs, or if you people also raise the thing of being very allergic to animals. The difficulty with that is, even if a scheme does currently ban animals, the majority can simply change that rule. So the idea that strata can somehow be a guarantee that you will never live near an animal is simply, is a misunderstanding. It's simply untrue. You cannot guarantee you won't live near animals, because even if there is a pet ban, it can be changed. So using that as a reason to support pet bans doesn't really make sense. But the main thing is, it's just, unless someone disturbs you, you shouldn't be able to regulate them. And if I'll just, by way of comparison, I think this is a hangover from the 1960s, when Australians thought apartments were so very different. We live on quarter-acre blocks. It's so weird living in apartments. We need special rules to make it work. The reality is, most Australians now live in pretty high-density cities, and many of us live in terraces, or we live in semis. Our neighbours are very, very close to us. If they have a dog in the backyard or a dog inside their house barking, we absolutely can hear it. And there is nothing you can do about it other than call the council. You most certainly can't ban your neighbour keeping a dog. And the reality is, there are millions of dogs in Australia. There are so many. And yet, is it really a problem in high-density suburbs, in the inner city, in terraces? It is a problem. It is there. But is it something that people appear to be tortured by? Constantly, their neighbours' dogs. Really, it's the exception rather than the rule. And it just seems to me that strata bans on pets in strata cause way more dispute than actual pets do.
Yes, and I want to tap into that, because I know that is the incentive, or should be the incentive, for change, because we shouldn't be having these disputes clogging up our legal system and have this uncertainty for owners. But first of all, I was going to ask you, Cathy, why you thought our legislation was this way, and why we have such broad bylaw making power. You've said there in particular, the 1960s, apartments, new, scary, very different culturally, very different for Australians, not the quarter-acre block. So is that, do you say that's the difference? We look at other, in Europe and in the UK, where you have seen people living in apartments for generations. They don't seem to have this hang up about regulating their neighbours, do they?
No, and it's just that's the thing. There are cities all over the world like, Manhattan and Paris and Barcelona, where everybody lives in apartments. So if you ban people having pets in apartments, no one can have pets. So it's just all over the world, people live with pets in apartments and the sky doesn't fall down. So I think it is very much, there are things in the model bylaws you can see are really dated. I was thinking of this when we were talking about masks. The bit in the model bylaws about being dressed appropriately on common property. That's a real 1960s hangover. Every time I look at that, it makes me freak. I'm just like,
I want to know who's had to enforce that one.
Well, yeah, I think that's really quite disturbing that that's there. But I think it definitely is a hangover, because often when you have conversations with this, you get these very kind of confused logic of, it's cruel to dogs. It's like, well, that's not your job to police that. So I had an article in the Herald earlier this week, and one of the points I made is, if you think someone's keeping a dog cruelly, the answer is contact the RSPCA. It's not, like, I live in a semi. It's not my job to regulate whether my neighbour is keeping their dog appropriately. If I think it's cruel, I should contact the RSPCA. If I don't think it's cruel, I should mind my own business. If it disturbs me, I should contact the council. But I don't think anyone who lives outside Strata thinks they should be able to ban their neighbours keeping dogs, even if their dogs are incredibly close to them. I should also say, in the letters in the Herald, a lot of people accuse me of being a dog lover. I don't want to upset people. I don't dislike dogs, but I don't have a dog. I've never had a dog, and I don't want a dog. And I think they're beautiful.
Revealed.
I know, I'm sorry, but I find them too needy. So, but the point is, my opinion of dogs is neither here nor there as to whether somebody else keeps one. It doesn't matter what I think as to whether you should be allowed to have a dog, Amanda. As long as your dog doesn't disturb me, it's none of my business. So, and I definitely think it's dated. It's a dated thing.
Yes, and now that we have seen this raft of litigation in New South Wales, and these are cases that have been running through our tribunal really since people got a handle on our new Section 139 can't have harsh, unconscionable or oppressive bylaws. And you were talking about it at the time. Is this going to be used to try and overrule pet bans? That's exactly what happened. We've seen cases at the lowest level of our tribunal then go before the appeal panel and be completely reversed. And now Joe Cooper's case is going through the Court of Appeal. Let's talk about the policy here, the public interest, I suppose, in having clear legislation, and then legislation that reflects, I'm going to say the words, contemporary community standards. What's all that about, and why is that important?
Oh, sorry. I didn't realise I had
That's all right. Take it. Let us listen in.
No, please. It's my mum. I'll call her back, I promise. So one of the things that people are often, like, I argued very hard in the Strata review that we needed a provision that said bylaws must be reasonable. I think people are a little nervous of that. We've got harsh, unconscionable and oppressive, which is, I think, a higher bar. I think the thing is for people really to get their heads around the idea that you cannot avoid judgment in property law. So this is actually the subject of my entire book, that it doesn't matter whether the question about whether it's reasonable or okay for people to ban their neighbours having a pet is always going to be there. Not having a provision in legislation that allows people to have a discussion about that, about whether it's valid, doesn't make the question go away. It is still there, but you just haven't allowed people to actually have any kind of discussion about it. So people being really nervous about a provision that says that you can't predefine, that's just inevitable in law. You cannot have rules that will give you the right answer 100% of the time. It's just, I once did a search actually on OSLI, which is the legal database, for the word unreasonable and reasonable, and came up with 300,000 hits. So it's everywhere in law, and you cannot avoid it. So the example I give also when I'm talking about this is the bylaw that I think it still exists at Liberty Grove, that children under the age of 12 cannot be on common property without a resident adult above the age of 21. Their common property are parks, basketball courts, tennis courts. you can't, there's no avoiding that question of whether that bylaw, whether that rule is reasonable. The question of whether it's reasonable is always going to be there. But if you don't have any provision in legislation that allows people to say it's unreasonable or it's harsh or unconscionable, all you do is just stop people being able to have a conversation about it. But the question remains. And we can't avoid it in property law. So we just have to accept that there is going to be this kind of flexible provision where you have to make an argument to say that your bylaw is reasonable or it is, it's not harsh, unconscionable, oppressive. Because when you think about it, what's the alternative? That it's okay for schemes to make bylaws that are harsh, unconscionable, and oppressive? That's a terrible idea.
Yep.
Yes, I don't care that it's oppressive. I'm allowed to do it because we democratically agree to it. And then just also finally, I mean, Amanda's heard me talk about this, but the greatest example of this is racially restrictive covenants in the United States. We're given free rein. Property developers routinely created suburban subdivisions with restrictions on them, which are just like bylaws, restricting occupation and ownership of land to Caucasians. It's why America, one of the central reasons why America has such appalling race problems is because of residential apartheid. And that was all a result of the idea of, well, as long as people agree to it, as long as it's freely agreed, who are we to say they can't do it? And is incredibly obvious with that example. There are times when you do have to say to private citizens, actually, it doesn't matter that you've freely agreed it, it's still not okay. And that's what we routinely do in Australia. That would be illegal in Australia. We say, the legislature will come in over the top of you and that is illegal. You cannot do that. It doesn't matter that you freely agreed it. That doesn't not legitimate all rules in relation to land.
So do you think that's where we're heading with bylaws generally, or perhaps just with pets? I know in Queensland they have the reasonable, unreasonable test when it comes to their bylaws, and that has meant that pets are generally allowed, as I understand it, in our Queensland strata schemes, or attempts to ban them at least don't get very far. Did you see, Cathy, the last couple of weeks, the amendment that's been proposed to our sustainability infrastructure bill, which did look quite hastily put together? And I wasn't prepared to raise this with you, but I think just off the top of my head, it's that if the bylaw purports to unreasonably restrict the keeping of pets, if that got through, would that solve our problem?
Yeah, so it came through as the Animal Rights Party introduced it. I don't know that anyone knew that we're going to do it. I just think you need a bylaw you need a provision of legislation that says you can't ban people keeping pets at all. And then the answer is you focus on the actual problem. So there's always been a power in the tribunal to order the removal of problem pets, which is one more solution than most people have in relation to housing. Most people, you can just call the council. I can't make my neighbours remove their dog, even if there's no possibility. All I can do is call the council. So strata schemes already have an added protection, and that is the power to go to a tribunal, which will order the removal of an animal from someone's home. That's really quite an extraordinary power. So look, I think it's inevitable. I think part of it, though, the Queensland one is interesting. I think part of it, those provisions that say that bylaws have to be reasonable or they may not be harsh or oppressive, a lot of them, they work depending on how the culture, the judicial, I think, or legal culture of believing that it is okay to override democratically agreed decisions, because Queensland's had that provision for years, and it's only in recent years, as a result of litigation after litigation after litigation, that tribunal members started to think, look, I feel really uncomfortable upholding these pet bans, particularly obviously in Queensland. There's a lot of retirees. Pets are very important to people, and so Queensland's legislation didn't change at all. Their tribunal decisions just changed. So they started to say bylaws are, under the legislation, can regulate the use of common property. A total ban is not regulation. I mean, as a lawyer, I can tell you that's wrong. There's lots of regulation that does actually involve bans. It's a bit of a sleight of hand, but I think more of it's a cultural change of people suddenly realizing, actually, why are we doing this? This is really, it's causing so much dispute, and it's very clear that pets are very important to people, and it's also very clear that a lot of pets cause absolutely no disturbance to anyone else in the building.
Yeah, very true. And looking at the specific circumstances of the building and then regulating the outcome of keeping the animal has always been the guidance that I provide, because, of course, as you say, Cathy, having a cat in a 15-story building where the cat's on level 14 and the person who's allergic to the cat is on level 2 never cross paths, and then having a ban because of that, is odd.
Yeah.
Shall we
Also,
say.
the thing I always raise with people is the Companion Animals Act, which is the piece of legislation that regulates pets normally in the community. There is this ridiculous situation where a scheme can ban someone keeping a cat that never leaves an apartment, and yet there is nothing they can do about every single cat in the neighbourhood sunning themselves on common property and doing those less picturesque things that cats do. You cannot actually stop that, because under the Companion Animals Act, in a community, you are required to be tolerant. People are not required to keep their cats inside. You cannot keep other people's cats out of your yard unless they're a problem cat. And I don't know that I've ever seen any case law on a cat that's managed to prove itself to be a
Cats are
problem cat.
perfect, Cathy. No problem cats,
The
right?
fact is, lots of people complain about cats in the yard, but there's nothing they can do about it. And I don't think people lie awake at night worrying about it too much, because they don't have the power to stop cats being in their yard. So they just take a deep breath and deal with it.
Isn't that the story of Strata, though? Because you have the right, as people see it, to stop your neighbour from making noise at 10:30 p.m., to regulate how they what rubbish they put in what bins, to limit their renovation works, whatever it is, any number of things. Because we can, it bothers us when there's a breach.
Absolutely.
I live in Strata. I understand. I have the same conversation with my husband. If you were in a semi, as you are, Cathy, in an urban area, and someone was banging up and down the dividing wall, nothing you can do about it. But in Strata, we have these incredible powers.
Yep. So, I mean, things like kids playing outside, you see strata schemes where someone's making a noise complaint because they can hear a kid bouncing a basketball.
Yes.
If they were doing it out on the footpath, there is nothing you can do. If you rang the police, they would say, take a deep breath and have a lie down. You live in a community, you hear people make noise, and it's an unfortunate thing, psychology, as you say, that because people do have the power to regulate, they feel like they should. And they maybe get bothered by stuff that if they weren't living in a strata scheme, they'd just go, well, there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. I'm just seeing some comments here. Pets in Strata is saying Emma didn't have enough time. And I know that's a reference to Emma Hurst, who is the member of the Animal Justice Party who put forward the amendment to the Sustainability Infrastructure Bill. She was contacted last minute to make that amendment, and they are looking at wording as we speak. That's interesting.
Right.
And I wonder if they're talking to some Strata lawyers on that would be a good idea. Something else popped into my head about that as well. Oh, yes, a review. So some of my colleagues are saying the Strata Schemes Management Act in New South Wales is due for review. And I know there are some stakeholder groups being formed, and some groups talking to the College of Strata Lawyers as well about that. And the word on the street seems to be that would be the best place to have proper consideration of this issue, and puts a call out for submissions and have a proper public consultation process. Which I sort of predict that might be the way that it will go.
Yeah.
These changes.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, I think it's just a matter of time as more and more people live in strata schemes, and also things like we did during the pandemic. I mean, it is so clear that pets are really, really important to people's well-being. I asked my students before we started teaching this semester just to tell us a bit about themselves and how they found lockdown, what had been good, what had been bad. I think at least 75% of my students mentioned their pets, and my students they're not kids, they're adults. They're anywhere between the ages of 22 and 62. So it was very, very clear that pets were incredibly important to people during lockdown, along with green space.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it just has been these last 6 months, the light that's been shone on what's going on in apartments, the issues for people living in apartments, managers, the lawyers, the new questions that we're having. It's quite fascinating, and I think we're seeing a lot of change and a lot of forced movement, forced change, especially when it comes to tech as well, and online meetings. I've been talking to Strata managers about tech that's been around for such a long time, electronic voting platforms, and the ability to have online meetings, but it hasn't been used because it hasn't had to be used. And now we're being forced to use it. Wow, isn't this efficient? Having a meeting by Zoom, and we can record it, and we can put our votes in through the poll. And if we use an electronic voting software, if we have a vote by show of hands, we can press a button when someone calls for a poll, and it immediately converts the results into unit entitlements. Oh my gosh.
Yes,
Fabulous.
yes, yes. That is so very true. I mean, we've seen that in universities, that there's, all of this facility is there, but until people are forced to use it, often people have no idea that it can work. If only we could get federal parliament on board. I think they might have managed their first online parliamentary sitting
Yes.
months after the rest of the country.
Yes, yes. A few old dogs to learn some new tricks there, I think.
Yeah.
Well, Cathy, we are very soon going to wrap up. This hour always flies by. Is there anything that you had a pressing desire to make sure you leave our viewers with? Anything you want to add, even if it's a completely different topic? We can talk about short-term letting if you want, or anything else
I
controversial.
talk about short-term letting in three minutes. Why is it a question of planning law? It's got nothing to do with strata. It's just planning law. It's just sloppiness in planning law. Everybody needs this to be clarified, not just strata schemes, people who live in ordinary suburbs. It is a failure of planning law. It is either zoned for Airbnb or it is not. It
Yeah.
shouldn't be up to private citizens to have to solve this problem for themselves. The government has really, really fallen down on this, and the planning department in particular.
There you go. She can do it. That was 30 seconds. That wasn't 3 minutes. That was 30 seconds. Good on you. Well, thank you, Cathy, and thank you to everybody who has been tuning in, whether you are on Facebook or on LinkedIn. I can see so many of you there. If you have liked today's discussion, if you've enjoyed what Cathy's had to share, please do give us a little thumbs up or a love heart. It just helps us spread that love with others, and share it to other friends, colleagues, neighbours, pages that you might have dedicated to strata issues. There's so many great ones out there. We want to reach as many people as we can with Cathy's brilliance. I really hope that we get to have our panel session at the College of Strata Lawyers conference next year, Cathy. It is about 6 months away, and we are fingers crossed that the world looks a little bit different. If not in person, then look, I'm about to run a 4-day online summit. I might learn a few skills there that I can share with our college to get our conference online. You never know.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Cathy, and thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous Friday night. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Thanks, everyone.